We've all heard reports of UFOs following people, typically while they are driving on some isolated roadway at night or walking through an expansive farmer's field towards home. These cases are so numerous it would take several books to list them all. Though in 1926, a 16-year-old high school student by the name of Alma Hughes had an experience unlike any other. Hers is far and away one of the more chilling accounts I've read, as the UFO she and her friend encountered appeared to be manned by less than friendly visitors. It was 1988. Alma Hughes was 78 years old and living in the Colonial Bell nursing home in Belleville, Texas, when she reached out to reporter Linda DeFore about a story she wanted to give her. Alma was born in Winfield, Louisiana, but moved to Dallas, Texas in 1968. She was an avid writer of poetry, who even had one of her poems, Raft, published in the Pine Hill Panorama column of the Shreveport Times newspaper, under her pen name, Alma Victoria Burns. At some point, Alma had decided to sit down and write out an experience she had involving a UFO that occurred when she was 16. An experience that she insisted was true and could be verified by friend Ella Lee Jackson, who was with her at the time. Jackson had moved to Houston in the years after the encounter, but the two were still somewhat close. Alma recalled that she was spending that Friday night hanging out with Ella. Both girls were 16 and attending high school in Winfield. The night was bright with a full moon. It was so bright that it seemed to glow eerily, recalled Alma. To relieve the boredom, she and Ella had decided to go for a drive around town. Ella didn't like to drive, so Alma was tasked with backing the Ford out of the driveway and onto the street. She took a left and drove 2 blocks that took them onto Main Street. From there, they drove through the small business district, about 10 blocks, which came to a dead end. They then took a left and drove 1 more block, where they took a right onto Maple Street and kept driving east. The full moon was directly over Maple now, and Alma remembered saying to Ella that it looked like it was coming toward them. She continued to drive for at least 2 more blocks. It was not until they reached the 1.5-story ancestral longhouse with its half-circle porch that they realized the moon could not possibly travel that fast. Ella screamed suddenly as the moon seemed to be coming down upon them. Alma quickly turned the car around and drove as fast as she could, with the moon-like object following them. At the end of Maple, she turned left and switched off the car lights, turning right onto Main, leaving them off until she reached the business part of town. But it was so hard to see, and she thought she would surely get a ticket, so she turned them on again and slowed down. Suddenly to their right, but still in line with Maple, the object began gaining on them again. Alma couldn't help but notice that the town was deserted. There was nobody around at all. Suddenly, Alma realized they would have to take a right directly under the object's path to get to Ella's house. She turned off her lights again, hoping that this would distract the object, and drove into the driveway, but she made the mistake of turning on her lights again, and this time the object began to actually swoop down on them. They could hear the distinct sound of a motor, like that of an airplane, as they jumped out of the car. There was a door in the rear part of the garage, and that's where they headed, desperate to escape. The occupants of the craft must have known they were still in the garage, for suddenly they heard a hissing sound above the garage, and they realized the craft was somehow spraying something onto the roof of the garage. The 2 girls, huddled by the back door, suddenly found it very difficult to breathe. They both decided they needed to get away, and so through the fumes, they attempted to go out the back door and cross the small yard toward the screen-side porch of the house. Apparently they were spotted as they ran up the steps. Ella's mother opened the door. Ella looked back over her shoulder at the object, but Alma shoved her inside in time, but it was too late for her. The craft managed to spray her entire left side just before she squeezed through the same door. Alma noted that the liquid felt ice cold, and it left her trembling. Once inside the house, Alma was overcome with dread thinking about what had just happened. She felt that if the object could have crossed that yard and sprayed the house's roof, it surely would have done so. Alma also couldn't help but think that whomever was inside the craft must not have had access to a rifle, for she felt that they would have almost certainly fired at her. When Ella and Alma opened the door slightly a little later to see if the object was still there, they heard, quote, two men, or whatever they were, talking. One of them possessed a gruff voice, and his tone sounded angry, but neither girl could understand the words that they were speaking. Then, before they knew it, the object was speeding away towards the west. With my mind a little clearer now that the danger seemed to be past, I tried to analyze this whole incident. I remembered how all the way from Maple Street to the driveway, the UFO had flown almost in a straight line from east to west, and stayed in the direct beam of the moon in the east, as if using it for a guide. Then from the driveway to Main 2 blocks, and from Main to Maple 1 block. Therefore, from that distance, the air corridor between the parallel line of Maple and the parallel line of the driveway was less than 90 feet, the only variable the UFO seemed to be able to maneuver. And what was the purpose of its visit? Was it sending back messages to its home base? And with what was it sending back those messages? Where was the object's home base? All these questions pounded over and over again in my mind as I went to sleep that night. The next morning, which was Saturday, Alma went home early, around noon. After arriving home and changing her clothes, she decided to go for a walk in her yard, still mulling over what had happened to her the previous night. The sun was burning brightly directly overhead when suddenly Alma felt a painful sensation in her arms, and looking down, she saw that the skin there had turned fiery red. Quickly she walked back into the house, not knowing what else to do, when the phone rang. It was Ella, and she told me that the roof of her garage had just caught fire and had burned completely away before the fire trucks had had a chance to come out to save it. That's when I told her about the burning on my arms and face, and that's also when the other terrible thought struck me. The liquid that had been sprayed on the roof seemed to become spontaneously combustible in the direct rays of the sun. If I had worn the same dress I had on when I had been sprayed, I would have probably burned up like the roof. According to Alma, both her and Ella's parents reported the UFO attack to the Baton Rouge police and even to officials in Washington. Calvin Coolidge was president at that time, but if he received the report, we never knew because no one ever contacted us. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic to Paris, France. His Spirit of St. Louis could fly in any direction. The 1926 UFO could not. Lindbergh's plane could not hover like a helicopter because it had not yet been perfected in the United States. The 1926 UFO could, however. In 1926, the U.S. had yellow phosphorus crystal flakes, which they burned for smoke screens in World War I, 1918. But did we have a cold liquid which became spontaneously combustible in the direct rays of the sun? The 1926 UFO did. Was it possible the creatures in the UFO were flying at night because they knew the direct rays of the sun could affect anyone they sprayed the next day in the same way as had happened to me and the roof? In my opinion, the U.S. should pinpoint Winfield, Louisiana, which is at about 32 degrees east-west longitude, and run a straight line due west-east around the world and back to Winfield. Then they should ask the countries bordering that longitude if they have any 1926 recordings of UFO sightings or attacks. It might begin to unravel all those long-awaited UFO mysteries. I think also that the nations of this earth should stop fighting with each other and join together in a space program effort to find out what is really happening out there. Alma's story appeared in the September 29, 1988 edition of the Brenham Banner Press. I have read of cases from the Second World War in which UFOs were observed attacking soldiers, with various dangerous substances, usually in response to being fired at. So Alma's case isn't a first of its kind, but it is indeed rare. I do have to wonder what exactly Alma and Ella did to cause the occupants of the UFO to react the way they did. According to Alma, the men they heard sounded angry, and certainly they seemed intent on hurting these two women, as evidenced by them spraying the combustible substance at them. I wonder if it had to do with the fact that they managed to elude capture. If the entire thing had been an experiment to observe their reactions, then why spray the substance, especially since they would not be around to observe the effects? Their intent definitely seemed to be to seriously injure or outright kill these two women, if not that night, then at a later date. But why? Alma noticed that the object was limited in how it moved. Also, she pointed out the distinct sound of a motor, quote, like that of an airplane. Most UFO cases, witnesses describe hearing a whirring or a buzzing sound, not the sound of a motor from an airplane. Was this some kind of man-made craft? And were the pilots merely foreigners, hence Alma's and Ella's inability to understand their language? Curiously, Alma noted that the object appeared like the moon, or a bright glowing ball. I'm not aware of any conventional aircrafts in 1926 that resembled a large glowing ball of light. Sadly, Alma does not indicate what became of the dress, maybe because they received no response from the officials they reached out to for help. Alma or her parents either washed it or tossed it out. I would be interested to find out exactly what the substance was. In recent years, there seems to be a real push by some folks in the UFO community to suggest that the visitors are benign or acting in a way that is beneficial to Earth and its inhabitants. I don't believe this to be true. History provides evidence to the contrary. Cases like Alma's, cases lost in the memory hole of time, definitely seem to indicate that at least some of these visitors aren't the saviors they are made out to be. Alma's case points to something else, something sinister. Alma worried that had she been wearing the dress that had been sprayed that day, she would have almost certainly been burned alive. This is truly frightening on so many levels. While Alma might have come away unscathed for the most part, I have to wonder how many others weren't so lucky.